In the language of my Tsimshian ancestors, N'it, hello, and Toyoksim, thank you everyone for joining us here today. My name is Margaret Foe. I'm Tsimshian, a member of the Lakwa Lambs Band in Port Simpson, British Columbia, and a descendant of the Eagle Clan. I want to just start off before I go into the formalities by acknowledging that we have premiers from across Canada here today to sit with our Prime Minister. And we know that they are focusing on the $100 billion ask towards health. And we all know that housing, especially over the past 3 years, through COVID, through fires, through floods, through climate emergencies, that housing is the panacea. And so if we were to say to you that we know a $6 billion investment towards housing would save $10 billion in healthcare and other services, we would ask all of you to support our ask to all of the premiers and leaders at all levels of government to recognize the ongoing failure to execute on the last few mandate letters in funding an urban, rural, and northern housing strategy that requires immediate and dedicated funding in budget of 2023, which needs to be substantially more than the $300 million from budget 2022. At a minimum, we're calling for the $6.3 billion annual investment that was tabled by the National Housing Council in 2022. So with that, and you guys have all been given our official media release, which includes much of the background and the statistics that found our organization and the announcements we're going to make today. So I'm not going to go into those details, but it is my honor to introduce you all today to the first ever public announcement about the creation of NICHI, the National Indigenous Housing Collaborative Incorporated. This brand new national organization, NICHI, is founded after decades of ongoing negotiation with the federal government for meaningful inclusion of urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing experts at the economic tables of Canada. True reconciliation and implementation of the rights of Indigenous peoples in Canada must include our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit leadership. What is also equally true, given that over 80% of all Indigenous peoples are dispossessed from their direct connections to these three distinctions-based groups, our urban, rural, and northern housing and support experts from across Canada have been filling the gap of Indigenous peoples who need to reside off reserve or off community. And therefore, we call on government to ensure that we are included at all of the economic tables across Canada. The Coalition of Urban Housing and Support Experts that came together from across Canada on November 25th signed our first declaration proclaiming our inherent rights to self-determination and inclusion at the federal government tables around housing, health, and supports. And they directed a sub-working group to create the first ever Urban Indigenous National Housing Center, now called NICHI, National Indigenous Collaborative Housing Incorporated. So I share great pride and honor for all of the hard work that our coalition pulled together in very short order to incorporate NICHI on December 21st, 2022, and to deliver our declaration to the government agencies within Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation and Indigenous Services Canada, insisting on a reorientation of the $300 million that was allocated in budget 2022 for the co-creation of an urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing strategy, and insist that NICHI is the new national organization that can deliver best on the mandate letters of this government. It is my pleasure to be here with two other strong NICHI members who will speak momentarily. The important point to acknowledge is that the members of the coalition that founded NICHI collectively bring together thousands of years of demonstrated expertise and business savviness to deliver a true for Indigenous, by Indigenous framework that breaks down colonial constructs that have clearly failed our urban, rural, and northern Indigenous peoples across Canada. In fact, we have been able to evidence over 200% direct return on investment for every dollar spent in our urban Indigenous portfolios, and over 700% in social returns on investment. But you know, here's the real challenge. Nothing we are saying today or have said over the last decade or so, or calling for, is new. Not the obvious needs that we all see in our communities, nor the business case. In truth, both the demonstrated needs and evidence of the powerful business impact urban, rural, and northern housing and support providers have and continue to make dates back to the very first urban native housing providers in the 1970s. What we continue to demand from our federal government is not only the inclusion of urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing and support leaders at the table, but that government must make immediate, meaningful, and sustained investments to stave off the ongoing crisis that not only are we all aware of and experiencing, but has most particularly exacerbated the housing and health crisis for Indigenous peoples that need to reside in urban, rural, and northern communities, also known as off the reserves or away from their home communities. And all of this has been evidenced in multiple reports of long and recent history, including the most recent submission by the National Housing Council ahead of Budget 2022, which demanded a minimum of $6.3 billion per year be invested in an urban, rural, and northern housing strategy. We stand by this as a minimum investment required for culturally appropriate and trauma-informed wraparound services that would increase the supply of safe, stable, affordable housing units by at least 73,000 new housing units and accelerate action on Indigenous homelessness. I'm going to leave it there and turn things over to Justin Marchand, who is Métis, a member of the NICHI Coalition, and a CEO of the Ontario Aboriginal Housing Services. OAHS and its related organizations have been serving Indigenous peoples living in urban, rural, and northern areas for well over 30 years. Justin?
Speak which, Margaret. As Margaret mentioned, my name's Justin Marchand. My spirit name is B1 or Fire Rock, and my clan is Eagle. Canada has a problem, and we have a solution. We now need a federal government who wants to work together in partnership on that solution. Housing issues are now front and center for many Canadians, their family, friends, colleagues, or themselves. But for a much longer period of time, a lack of safe, affordable housing has been and is a critical issue for Indigenous people living in urban, rural, and northern areas. Indigenous people are significantly overrepresented in areas like homeless counts, in incarceration, as survivors of violence, in healthcare needs, in the number of youth who are, quote, in care. So Canada can either continue approaches that exacerbate violence and exclusion, or Canada can make investments in people for what Treasury Board says are the most urgent and unmet needs. There is an enormous amount of work to do, but we are absolutely ready. Canada launched the National Housing Strategy in 2017, but the NHS left out the people who have the most urgent and unmet needs. This includes the 87% of Indigenous people who live in urban, rural, and northern areas. Although 87% of Indigenous people live in these urban areas, the NHS has forgotten the vast majority of Indigenous people in that so-called National Housing Strategy. Canada and other provincial and local governments can continue to waste resources on reactionary activities that are expensive, or we can invest in people. We can continue to spend more and more money on backlogged hospital emergency rooms, more money on ambulances, more money on incarceration, or we can invest in preventative measures like safe and affordable housing with the supports that people need. Canada knows it has this problem. Although we've conducted our own research, Canada has commissioned a number of reports and studies that Canada itself says is failing. This includes the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls report, which mentions housing 299 times. The lack of housing being a contributing cause of violence, but hopefully the provision of which can be a major part of the solution to end violence against Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people. The Parliamentary Budget Officer conducted its own research and issued a report in this area. The Parliament commissioned the Humor Report, which had the unanimous support of the 3 largest national political parties calling on this to happen. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, including the supporting Canadian legislation, says that Indigenous people have a right to administer programs that have impacts on their lives, including housing. There was also a National Housing Council that was appointed by one of the current ministers responsible for housing. And that National Housing Council has said that there needs to be a major investment in urban, rural, northern Indigenous housing to the tune of over $63 billion over 10 years. The Prime Minister's office has issued mandate letters to various ministers for several years, calling on this to happen. But there's also broad support outside of government. Last week, Scotiabank called on Canada to double the amount of social housing just to reach the G7 average. Canada is behind our G7 partners, and Canada is once again failing Indigenous people who live in rural, urban, and northern areas that are without safe, affordable housing. Indigenous governed and Indigenous-led housing and service providers have come together from coast to coast to coast to create a specific organizational vehicle that allows the federal government to explicitly support and be part of this solution. The NICHI Coalition is an organization comprised of urban, rural, and northern Indigenous governed organizations that have been doing this work for up to 50 years each or more, with limited support over time. The NICHI Coalition is a coalition of the willing, where people and organizations who are ready, willing, and able to do the hard work. And now we just need a federal government who's willing to make the investment in Indigenous people who have been left behind. I'd now like to turn the floor over to Katlia Lafferty, who's going to speak about the status of earned housing. Katlia is one of the founding members of the NICHI Coalition as well too. Miigwech for joining us today, Katlia.
Pomado, good morning. Thank you for the introduction. I am from the Northwest Territories. I'm Yellowknife Dene First Nation and the co-chair of the National Indigenous Housing Network and the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. So housing issues paint a picture of the numerous housing violations that are impacting the everyday lives of Indigenous people. That began when housing first entered the North and infringed on the lands of the Indigenous peoples, forcing us out of our relationship with the land. And some of these issues that we are facing right now are as follows. The highest suicide rates across the country are in Nunavut and are linked to a loss of cultural livelihood, which is a direct result of housing infringement. There are a lack of shelters and transition homes in remote northern communities of the Northwest Territories and Nunavut for women and children wanting to flee violence, causing women to have no choice but to stay with abusive partners, thus increasing their likelihood of intimate partner death related to violence. Northerners seeking a higher education will lose their housing when they leave their home community to go down south, because there is no post-secondary education. Thus, there is no incentivized education for Indigenous Northerners to get ahead. Families can't visit with one another for extended periods of time, or the rent is raised. Indigenous peoples are overrepresented in the criminal justice system across Canada. There is a lack of mechanisms in place for rehabilitation into housing once released, and often offenders will recriminalize themselves for just a warm place to sleep and something to eat when they're rendered homeless. Housing is integral to healthcare, we know this. There are babies dying in northern remote communities as we speak because they are breathing in mold. We can't just build houses anymore. We need to build homes that are built to withstand winters. We need to work on creating a path for our communities to become healthy again prior to colonization. Canada's opioid epidemic is impacting the homeless population who are dying on the streets every day at alarming rates as we walk past them. Living in mold-infested housing is like breathing in a plastic bag. There is a lack of health data indicators to provide linkages to fatal illness caused from living in inadequate housing environments. Poor plumbing, lack of ventilation, lack of insulation, inability to afford heat It's all outlined in former Inuit parliamentarian Mumilat Kakak's report, Sick of Waiting, which was released in 2021. With the federal government now focusing on healthcare, this is an opportunity to do things right and put money into Indigenous housing for healthcare, Indigenous-led housing for healthcare. There is a lack of health data to provide linkages to fatal illness caused from living in inadequate housing environments. And doctors are not tracking client visits to determine the amount of Indigenous peoples who are going to the doctor with implications of homelessness and health problems related to inadequate housing, including even asthma and eczema, which is flared up when inhaling mold. Child apprehension due to poverty speaks to the need to enact Bill C-92, an act respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children, youth, and families, which our group will also provide support for. Indigenous women and girls are between 3.5 times more likely to be victims of violent crimes than other women, and the violence they face is often more severe. This is a fact. The MMIWG report mentions the need for safety and security in housing more than 200 times. And 4,000 Indigenous women that have been counted, but far more, have gone missing or have been murdered in Canada in the past 3 decades alone. Indigenous peoples are more vulnerable to sex trafficking and gang-affiliated violence when living in government housing. Colonization and methods of assimilation through westernized imposed healthcare combined with the inability to give birth in one's own home has interrupted traditional Indigenous birthing practices. The government continues to fund unsustainable infrastructure where poor housing materials are shipped into communities to save money. The houses which are built over time become unlivable. Coastal erosion due to climate change and emergent relocation is not factored into government housing schemes. There is a deep loss of spiritual and cultural connection to land-based living since the colonial government has attempted to assimilate Indigenous peoples. NICHI will bring back these significant aspects of living to improve the quality of life for Indigenous people living in rural, remote, and northern communities, and to become self-determining once again. We must reduce the dependency on government-run programs, including utility companies that are shutting off clients' power. They are literally sitting in the dark if they do not pay their bills on time, essentially leaving residents helpless. 80% of Indigenous peoples living in remote, urban, and rural areas do not receive housing support from their respective communities. And even those in community are not receiving the assistance they require in the form of numerous unfulfilled maintenance requests and long wait lists for housing. We can help support this work. There is a lack of independent watchdogs for quality and risk assurance to ensure that government-run and nonprofit housing programs are actually effective. Income support is not time valued. Livable monthly wages are the same as they were decades ago, to the point that people cannot be expected to live on only $700 per month and also afford to provide food. Culturally relevant design is not being taken into consideration. Many housing units are being built as single units, so people who want to get their kids back from child welfare system are not able to because they don't have enough room. The government calls this overcrowding, but it's not a problem that was created by Indigenous peoples who are often inclined to live with extended families in healthy environments. Discrimination towards those with criminal records or addictions and mental health is becoming more and more, where we see that people need co-signers now to live in housing. And in the north, government correctional facilities are sitting empty when they could be housing the homeless. Garnished wages, charging more than market rent, inflation on child tax benefits as income, thousands of dollars in arrears are all a part of housing, as commodification is an intrusive violation of privacy through the enforced government review of personal bank statements for monthly reporting. This has got to stop. The Auditor General's report on chronic homelessness shows that the government cannot prove that they're reducing homelessness, which is why Indigenous-led housing is the only way to solve the housing crisis. Place-based teachings are the laws and legal orders of Indigenous peoples. When we do not have our roots in place, we cannot be healthy. That is why we are overwhelmingly overrepresented in the criminal justice system, have the highest suicide rates, the lowest education rates, and the poorest health indicators in Canada. Housing is our foundation and where it begins. It is difficult to focus on anything else when you do not have a healthy home. The solution has been here all along, and now we are here asserting our Indigenous rights, both collectively and individually, with our own agency. And it's about time we have the opportunity to demonstrate that as a collective group of Indigenous organizations from coast to coast, we can effectively manage the money that is required to do this work across the country and solve this housing problem once and for all. Masicho. I will now turn it over to questions. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So we are now going to host a moderated Q&A. So media in attendance are invited to ask questions using the Q&A function on Zoom. You can find it at the bottom of your screen. And we will read out your question. And if you can include the outlet that you're asking the question from too, we would greatly appreciate that. So to get us started, I will direct our first question to Justin. So Justin, you've shared that the coalition is looking for approximately $6 billion in the next federal budget. What are the objectives and the intentions to use this funding for?
Yeah, thanks very much, Jasmine. So there's three primary activities. One is to first develop or further develop a FIBI National Housing Center, so for Indigenous by Indigenous National Housing Center, and that will serve as the vehicle through which the federal government can make these much needed investments. We already, as Margaret mentioned, we've already done some of that work on our own, and we'll be looking to increase the capacity of that specific housing center. The second thing is we need to increase the supply of stable, safe, affordable housing by 73,000 units. That's really the primary purpose of what we're here for, is to help people with their housing needs. And the third thing is we need to accelerate action on Indigenous homelessness, which includes wraparound support services so that Indigenous people have long-term success and well-being. And just briefly on that note about Indigenous homelessness, we see that certainly, and I'll speak more to some Ontario figures, but when you're looking at homeless counts in various municipalities across Ontario, in Southern Ontario, you're looking anywhere from 22 to 35% of the people experiencing homelessness are Indigenous, and this is despite only being about 2% of the population, depending on which city you're looking at. It's certainly much higher the further you go north in Ontario, up to 2/3 or 90+%. And then just the last thing I'll mention, Jasmine, to your question, this just further, these stats, which are government stats, just further demonstrate that the current mainstream approaches are clearly not working. And so we need something different. The current system and the current programs are clearly not working for Indigenous people in urban, rural, and northern areas. So we need to take, and are taking, an Indigenous governed and Indigenous led approach. And we know that that will work because when communities make their own decisions, this is what leads to long-term success.
Thank you, Justin. Katlia, the next question is for you, and Justin just touched on this briefly, but I wonder if you could elaborate a bit more on the importance of wraparound services. In your remarks, you talked about, particularly in northern and remote communities, the importance of these services. Could you elaborate on that?
So right now in the Northwest Territories, there's the excuse that there's no capacity to provide wraparound services. There is definitely the capacity. It's just that the communities need the support. So what is happening right now with housing is that the larger housing providers are actually getting the funding when they're applying and leaving the little guys out. So what our group can do is really focus on the north and make sure that we're supporting up and coming Indigenous-led organizations that have a mandate for housing so that they can do the work and in community, and people that are actually from there tasked with doing that, because Northerners know what's needed. And wraparound support services really improve the lives of individuals and children, family, youth, elders. It helps to prevent elder abuse by people just being there for one another, and it's just that sense of community that's really lacking when you're looking at housing. That's not factored in. Housing is often very individualized, and so what we would be doing is going back to Indigenous principles and legal orders of sharing with one another, helping one another, looking out for each other. These Indigenous principles are across the board, and we will bring those back in any way that we can to ensure that risk factors are mitigated, and that we're not perpetuating a legacy of trauma and experiencing any further effects of colonialism at this point.
Thank you, Katia. The next question comes from Emily Blake of the Canadian Press. And Margaret, I'm hoping you can kick us off on this question, but I imagine Justin and Katia may want to weigh in as well. So the question is, a report came out recently that most affordable housing projects approved by the federal government under the Rapid Housing Initiative have not yet been constructed. Federal government has cited supply chain disruptions, rising costs, and labor shortages. Experts say there's also been pushback from residents and a lack of support from provincial governments. Beyond funding, what would the coalition like to see, or how is it planning to address these issues when it comes to timely access to new housing?
Yeah, Toyoxit for that question, Emily. I'll just start off by, reframing some of the things that we've already talked about between Justin, Katia, and myself around the real concerns and why we're at the table, why we formed this new national organization, is the reality that a government top-down focus on these solutions hasn't been working. What we bring to the table that is different is the collective expertise and knowledge from across Canada. The coalition is greater than just the three of us, or even the six of us that were appointed to actually work on the National Centre. It's about bringing in the collective expertise of people from across Canada, as Justin had said, from coast to coast to coast. It's also recognizing the intricacies of housing are truly connected to everything. And Katia spoke a little bit about that. How can we focus on health if we don't have a safe place to rest? How can I address my addictions if I don't have a safe place to rest? How can I regain custody of my child if I don't have a safe place to rest and to bring my child? How can I have gainful employment if I don't have a safe place to rest? And if my house is located so far out of the community that I work, where there's no transit, no buses, and no taxis, and I have to now hitchhike on the highway of tears, we create vulnerability when we fail to look at the communities as individuals, and when we fail to have the expert knowledge of those local communities, which includes our urban Indigenous housing providers. But it also requires the breakdown of all of the silos that have been created, within government and also within our communities, where we call on the federal, provincial, municipal, and First Nations leadership to put aside those barriers and put aside those arguments and look at what needs to be created in that community through a multi-jurisdictional approach. And we believe that we can do that because we've been living within this for over 50 years, individually. And as I said, collectively across Canada, with nearly 140 urban native housing providers that have been doing this work for nearly 50 years, we have a lot of on the ground experience around infrastructure, climate challenges, child apprehension rates, addiction rates, homelessness rates, and everything that goes with that. And we've created relationships by and large with our local governments. So we're ideally placed to be that vehicle to help execute things like the Rapid Housing Initiative in a more inclusive manner. Thank you.
Justin, please weigh in. I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Jasmine. Much for the question, Emily. And this is one where it is difficult to deliver when you've been excluded from these mainstream programs. RHI 1 and RHI 2, CMHC says that should result, and you're quite right to point out, Emily, that that many of these projects haven't yet started, many of these developments haven't started, should produce over 10,000 units. Unfortunately, it's left out urban Indigenous people, urban Indigenous organizations. Of those 10,000 units, and these numbers haven't been disputed, we've done our best to validate this with CMHC, and their officials haven't disputed these numbers. But from what we can see, of the 10,000 units, there were 12 that went for urban Indigenous people. And so it's when we have these really sort of lopsided solutions that really aren't reflecting the data and the evidence that we need to change. And this is why we need a specific earn-FIBI approach using NICHI. I'll also point out too that RHI 3 has been launched, and despite our best efforts advocating to CMHC around the barriers that were in RHI 1 and RHI 2 that make it effectively impossible for urban Indigenous housing providers to access that funding, despite having the greatest need. Despite those efforts to advocate for a change to the program rules, RHI 3 is largely a copycat of 2 and 1. And so again, we're excluded. And you start to wonder, Emily, when, you know, maybe the first time you miss it, the second time perhaps you got busy, but why are we repeating programs that exclude the people that are most in need? I think that's probably a question that you'd have to ask CMHC or have to ask the minister.
Thank you, Justin. Katia, do you have anything to add? No?
No, I think that the business as usual type of housing is now going to end, because we need to make sure that we're not just housing people. As I said, we need to make sure that we're also providing those other services that are needed and helping people, retrofit their homes or whatnot. But we wouldn't actually be doing that work. We would be providing the funding to the Indigenous services providers to actually do that work. So it's not just housing, it's helping to set up treatment centers, it's helping to set up transition shelters and whatnot. So there's a lot more than just housing, for sure.
Thank you. So I wonder, Margaret, if I could have you weigh in on this first, and then I'll get Katia and Justin to provide some insight too. But can you elaborate on what this would look like in a couple of years in each of your respective regions? So Margaret, what would BC look like with NICHI leading this work?
Well, the Aboriginal Housing Management Association tabled the first ever For Indigenous by Indigenous provincial housing strategy for BC last year on January 26, 2022, that called for $7.3 billion. And that was pre-inflationary pressure issues, economic issues that we're all dealing with now. And, looking at Emily's question on, the rising costs around RHI and why some of those units are being challenged to get to ground. We know that our $7.3 billion ask was pre-inflationary pressures, pre-supply chain pressures. And so we know that number is only going to continue climbing. And what we're calling for is a spectrum of housing for Indigenous peoples in British Columbia, from complex care all the way through to home ownership. And so, ideally in a couple of years when NICHI is up and running and the government has made the immediate and sustained meaningful investments of a minimum $6.3 billion a year, is starting to actually chip away at those strategies that not only AMA has created, but other provinces have created. And then having a national urban strategy that kind of catapults off of those pre-existing research documents for the national level. Having that scaled up so that we are meeting the needs of our community in a culturally safe and trauma-informed way, because I think that's the missing link as well. When we look at the impact of colonialization over the last 150 years, the numbers speak how abysmal things have been in terms of impacting Indigenous peoples. You know, the way Katlia had outlined it in terms of suicide rates and education rates and homelessness rates. But we know that we have many Indigenous people that are ready to demonstrate, you know, a high success rate in home ownership. And so our housing strategy would look at meeting those needs all the way from complex care to home ownership. We also did act as a secretariat to the province of BC's urban Indigenous peoples, and just recently tabled the urban Indigenous homelessness strategy for BC as well. And so ideally, NICHI could take a look at those, and within the new funding structure, find a way to support the housing providers across BC and across Canada in meeting the needs of their community in a way that makes sense.
Katlia, could you weigh in perhaps on the North and talk about what that would look like in the territories?
Well, it would mean that the NWT Housing Corporation has to step aside and get out of the way and allow Indigenous-led organizations to do this work, because the Housing Corporation has had their opportunity and they have failed time and again. And so I would just say that, you know, this also stems from existing policies and legal frameworks in Canadian law that have historically set out to dispossess Indigenous peoples on our own homelands, starting with the Doctrine of Discovery and the Royal Proclamation, and then now the outdated Indian Act that we still all fall under. But with the help of precedent-setting case law, Indigenous peoples over time have been able to show that Aboriginal rights and title are directly linked to land access, and we're able to live out a sustainably, culturally, and spiritually significant life on the lands that have been inherited by our ancestors. And this is also outlined in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Yet the government still stands in the way of Indigenous peoples exercising this right when it comes to housing. And in the North, the landscape is very much different. Indigenous peoples are able to still lay claim over their lands and live within a passive income. But it's hard to do that when you don't have the means to afford to actually build your own home. So the vision is that Indigenous peoples will have autonomy over where they live, whether that be owning their own homes or having access to mental health care services and education without having to actually be sent down south and then running the risk of becoming homeless on the streets. This will also, the vision would be to create a social enterprise owned and operated by Indigenous peoples in the North that can produce, manufacture, and distribute kind of like an off-grid home that is expandable and collapsible, that really meets the needs of the changing environment, but also goes back to our ancestral ways of living nomadically. So these social enterprises could be run by communities, which also goes in alignment with for Indigenous by Indigenous, which is what we're speaking to today.
That's excellent. Thank you, Katlia. Justin, I think Ontario really embodies sort of the broad spectrum you see. You have, urban centers like Toronto and Ottawa, and of course, very remote communities in the North. Could you talk a bit about Ontario and how this would come to life?
Yeah, definitely, Jasmine. There's a number of different programs right across the housing continuum that are in place and have been proving to be quite effective. But now what we need is a meaningful investment to ramp those programs up. In Ontario, there's a need for 22,000 housing units for Indigenous people living in urban, rural, northern areas. So we have in Ontario, there's a network of 35 urban native housing providers that have been doing this work since the 1970s, 1980s, but we haven't seen the level of investment that's needed. You mentioned how else this could look in Ontario. We know that people need housing solutions based on their particular circumstance, and that means providing housing solutions right across the continuum. So whether it's street outreach, whether it's supportive housing of various different kinds, whether it's home repair, home ownership, Margaret touched on that. we strongly believe in supporting the success of people who are in rental housing right now, in affordable housing. And if folks are ready to move on to market home ownership, then what better investment can you make for a fraction of the cost of building is to move people into market home ownership, freeing that unit up for somebody else that needs that. So there's a whole wide range of solutions that are absolutely needed. And I just want to reinforce the point too, that housing means that you need the wraparound supports for individuals that need them. And that's why we have, as part of this coalition, a number of Indigenous service providers. So this is about us working together better. And to do that right now, we need that federal government investment to make this work.
Thank you, Justin. Those are really great insights. I'll just remind media, we have a little bit of time left. So if you do have questions, you're more than welcome to ask them in the Q&A function on Zoom. And you can also follow up with media requests via email. We will share a recording of today's press conference, a press release, and a fact sheet encompassing much of the information shared today. So for our next question, I'll direct it to Margaret. I know that NICHI has been meeting with government decision makers this week. I'm curious how is that going and what is next for the organization?
Yeah, thank you for that. We are here. We spent all day yesterday meeting with members of Parliament, presenting our business case around NICHI and the need for the dollars to be truly for Indigenous, by Indigenous, led through the National Indigenous Collaborative Housing. But what we're really talking about is asking government to start breaking down their own ministerial silos, because the investment is going to need, as we said to Minister Beausoleil yesterday around budget submissions, pre-budget submissions, we're really talking about government reorienting some of their funding streams. Yesterday, he talked about the, I think it was over $120 billion that was, being earmarked for various transit and infrastructure. And we know that many of the issues that we advocate for around housing are heavily impacted by transit, heavily impacted by infrastructure, also heavily impacted by industry. We know that in any community that has been impacted through industrial expansion, whether it's LNG, whether it's forestry, whatever industry is coming into a community, that there's great economic growth for sure, but the social impacts that tend to come alongside that need to be factored in and perhaps could be looked at as alternative funding streams when we think about man camps coming in and the rise in sex trade, the rise in sexual assaults, the rise in addictions, the rise in homelessness that come from industry coming into community, rent evictions, and I have personal experience with that in Kitimat with immediate family members who were paying $800 rent prior to industry. Industry comes in, they rent evict a bunch of people out of $800 a month rentals, renovate them, and they re-rent them out for $3,000, where the community had never gone over $500, $600, $700, $800 maximum for rentals, and so locals end up being ousted into regional communities outside of there to find appropriate housing. And so if we were to start to ask the federal government to look into the investments that they're looking at doing around multi-ministerial, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's health, whether it's child and care, we know that there needs to be a multi-sectoral approach to funding these needs. $6.3 billion is no small ask. It really should be around $100 billion when it comes to looking at the needs across this country for housing and factoring in, as Justin said, the wraparound supports that are typically required for some of the spectrum of our housing programs and infrastructure. We know that some of our communities, like I said earlier, don't have transit, don't have buses, don't have taxis, and that creates vulnerability for some of our most vulnerable communities. So our goal will be to be working with multi-ministers, talking to, Ministry of Infrastructure, talking to Ministry of Health, talking to Ministry of Crown Relations, Intergovernmental Affairs, and to the Ministry of Justice, because all of those have been affected because of the lack of housing. And so that would be on our goal as well.
Thank you, Margaret. That was a very powerful note to finish on. That will wrap up our Q&A. And so I would love just to give each of our panelists a moment to provide any final remarks. And so Katlia, perhaps I'll put you on the spot and let you begin.
Okay, yeah, I guess just the final thing I wanted to say was that in speaking with community members, I know that people are really afraid to share their stories of housing inadequacies. They're afraid of eviction. And so it's been really hard to find that information to share with everyone today on really what is happening in our communities. And some people are just not wanting to share their stories, but I do have to say, you know, as somebody that grew up in housing and in poverty, it's really important that we have a sense of home. So we're not just talking about housing, we're talking about that sense of home and that sense of purpose and belonging and having that identity and roots in our place-based teachings once again. We will not be operating like government. We will not be opening up shelters and kicking out residents or our people who are in encampments. That's not what we're about here. We are going to be doing things differently. There are developers right now purchasing properties in the inner cities who are saying that they're serving the Indigenous population so that they can receive the funding that is needed, and that's just got to stop. So, you know, and going back to my own experiences and my family's experiences, everyone I know, my cousins, my mother even was rendered homeless this past spring. Housing is like a curse on our land right now, and we need to fix the problem. And the only way, again, is for us Indigenous peoples to do that work. Unfortunately, we now kind of carry that burden to fix the problem that's been created by the colonial government and has dispossessed our people from our own lands.
Thank you, Katlia. Justin, would you like to go next?
Sure, thanks, Jasmine. I think in short, the time for action is now. The National Housing Strategy is more than 5 years old. The Prime Minister has directed a number of his ministers over several years to support an urban, rural, northern for Indigenous by Indigenous housing strategy. And we've been doing that work, a lot of that work largely on our own to this point. Without federal government support. So I think it's just, I think we're far past the language and the number of reports that the government has commissioned, and we just really need action right now. People are dying on the streets. People can't participate in the economy. They can't attend school, all because of a lack of safe, affordable housing. So we really need, the last 5 years has shown the National Housing Strategy is not working for Indigenous people living in urban, rural, northern areas. And we need that specific program that the Prime Minister has directed his ministers to do. And we need the subsequent investment to make sure that this is a successful rollout.
Thank you, Justin. And finally, I'll pass it off to Margaret.
Yep, and thank you for that. You know, I'll pick up where Justin left off and kind of touch a little bit on something that Katlia had said. You know, we're not asking anything of government that we ourselves haven't done. In truth, bringing together NICHI in short order on November 25th, signing of the first declaration, proclaiming our rights to self-determination. The coalition is about inclusivity. It is about making sure that all voices are welcome to our table. So we had to put aside our own political differences, our own self-interests, and our own personalities in many ways to come together. And in doing so, we had to agree on some key underlying principles and some key underlying outcomes. And that's all we're asking this federal government, all of our provincial premiers that are here in Ottawa today, and all of our municipal leaders and our local First Nations leaders and Métis leaders and Inuit leaders, is to put aside our political stripes, because the issue of housing and the crisis that we're in and how intricately housing ties to everything in the life cycle requires this to be a nonpartisan issue. It requires all hands on deck to put aside any of our differences and to just agree we need to get this done. And we've been very clear with government for well over a decade on how we could do that. And so we're asking them to put aside their own self-preservation about, business as usual, as Katlia talked about, and really take a look at the expertise that NICHI is bringing to the table in understanding all of those wraparound supports. Katlia also talked about, the vulnerability of our community and not wanting to really go public necessarily with all of the real human rights violations that are happening out there across this country. I would encourage everyone to take a look at our website at www.ahma-bc.org. I believe we have our recent YouTube video that was created after a year-long province-wide engagement session where we talked to everybody in every region of the province of BC about what's happening and sharing with them our strategy. And you will hear live story voices of people that are simply happy that they have survived to this date, and that they recognize the value and need of strong and sudden investments in urban Indigenous housing and why they support the concept of for Indigenous, by Indigenous. So I would encourage you all to watch that to get some real voices from community around the power of investing. And like I said, my last comment will be that, we're standing by the minimum investment of $6.3 billion when we know that $100 billion is being talked about right now around health services. And we know that health is intricately tied to housing. We actually need the government to be looking at the $6.3 billion as a minimum start in investments and get themselves higher up that financial food chain. So with that, I'll just say Toyak Sim again, thank you everyone for being here today. A big shout out to Crestview, a big shout out to all of the technical teams that have been working with us to get us here today. Toyak Sim, thanks everyone.